conquered and briefly ruled in the 4th century BC. Alexander had conquered Egypt from the Persian Empire in 131 BC and ordered the construction of a new city at the mouth of the river Nile Delta, which he named Alexandria. He then left the country eastwards, conquering all of Persia and campaigning to India, beyond the edges of the known world. His untimely death, 123 BC, at just 32 years of age, opened up a succession crisis, as Alexander's only legitimate child was still in his mother's womb at the time, and there was no consensus as to who should rule in his stead until a civil war erupted amongst Alexander's generals and companions for control of various parts of the empire. One of them was Ptolemy, a Macedonian general of considerable repute, who enjoyed support among subsections of the army. Years, in what have become known as the Wars of the Diadochi Crown Princes, Ptolemy established himself as ruler of Egypt, while several others secured control over other parts of the empire. Eventually, Alexander's child and heir, Alexander IV, was murdered in 9 BC. The Diadochi dropped the pretense of fighting to preserve the empire for Alexander's child and established their own kingdoms. Ptolemy became King Ptolemy I. In addition to Egypt, he secured control over parts of Libya, the island of Cyprus, and much of the Levant north along the coast towards modern-day Lebanon. The great rival of the Ptolemies here, which they would fight with in many wars, was the Seleucid Empire, which ruled from central Turkey east to Persia. The kingdom of Macedon controlled Greece itself. The Ptolemaic kingdom emerged in the 3rd century as the greatest of the Hellenistic kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean world, to result from Alexander's conquests. Alexandria was built into a magnificent city by Ptolemy and his successors, Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III. A great city learning, complete with the foremost library of the age. Many of the most fundamental early breakthroughs in the fields of mathematics, geography, and science were made by scholars like Euclid and Eratosthenes at Alexandria under Ptolemaic rule. Furthermore, while the Seleucid Empire began to lose much of its portraying in the east to the emergent powers like the Parthian Empire of Persia, and Macedon's control over Greece fragmented as new alliances of city-states emerged. The Ptolemaic kingdom managed to build a strong, centralized rule which flourished into the 2nd century BC. However, things were beginning to change long before Cleopatra was born. The center of military, economic, and political power in the Mediterranean Sea had always lain in the east. That is, until the rise of 2 major powers in the western Mediterranean, the Roman Republic in central Italy and Carthage in North Africa. After 2 decisive wars between them in the 3rd century BC, Rome emerged as the dominant power of the western Mediterranean. It wasn't long before the Romans began interfering in the eastern Mediterranean. Though they proved reluctant to rule over distant territory in the east for much of the 2nd century BC, by the time Cleopatra was born, all such reservations had long been abandoned. Just a few years after she was born, a Roman general, or Pompey the Great, defeated the Seleucid Empire and brought an end, forging Syria into a Roman province. It was into this precarious situation for the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt that Cleopatra was born. Cleopatra grew up in the most cultured and learned city world, and she had a very education, visiting the precinct where the Great Library was located in the museum, the complex of religious and cultural buildings in the city, seems plausible that her father instructed some of the city's leading scholars to oversee his children's education. To get a sense of how damning the intellectual environment was here, consider that Hero, Greek scholar associated with the city, was born right around the time Cleopatra was, and many years later would develop a working steam engine in the city. Had the Roman world exploited this technological breakthrough, it would have laid the grounds for a Roman industrial revolution. Cleopatra was believed to have been well enough educated that she wrote some medical texts in Greek during her youth. This story was later attested to by Arab scholars who might have had access to evidence which is now lost. It is open to doubt, though, given how common the name Cleopatra was in ancient Egypt. Perhaps they simply confused her authorship with that of another female scholar. Beyond this, her youth was lived in a hybrid culture. The members of the royal family were Macedonian from a genetic point of view and Greek from a cultural perspective. However, they ruled over Egypt, a very old culture that had its own traditions gathered over 3 millennia, going back to when the first pyramids were built. As such, the royal family adhered to many Egyptian traditions, particularly the worship of the Egyptian gods and goddesses like Osiris, Ra, and Amun. She grew up taking part in religious rituals involving these deities. Because of the cosmopolitan nature of Alexandria, she also learned to speak many languages, including Greek, Latin, Egyptian, and Hebrew, and perhaps others like Syriac and Ethiopian. Something which has garnered a lot of attention in modern times is the issue of Cleopatra's ethnicity and what she would have looked like. Although she would become one of the most famous female rulers of the ancient world, one widely written about by over 50 ancient historians and writers, there are few detailed ancient depictions of Cleopatra. There are several sculptures that are believed to be of her, yet these are not coloured. There are also a lot of smaller images. A side profile image of Cleopatra was incorporated into coins which were produced in Egypt during her reign, and she appears in many other royal guises around Egypt. The problem is, a coin, or indeed an ancient sculpture from which a paint that would have been applied has long since faded away, does not reveal skin colour. Consequently, several studies recently tried to suggest that Cleopatra was dark-skinned and African in her appearance. There is no real evidence to support this conclusion. Ptolemies were a Macedonian god of the Greek world. They might Egypt for this, but they did so as a foreign dynasty, controlling the country from a Greek capital in the far north of Egypt. Moreover, the Ptolemies were known for inbreeding, with sisters even marrying brothers, as we will see, in order to secure the royal dynasty's control over Egypt without challenge. Admittedly, her matrilineal descent is not 100% clear, yet the images on coins from her reign and other archaeological artifacts make it pretty clear that she had Hellenistic features reminiscent of Macedonian or Greek, rather than African. Cleopatra's life was being shaped from infancy by events in the wider Eastern Mediterranean, and in particular, the expansion of the Roman Republic to dominate the region. When she was just a toddler, the Roman commander Pompey had been dispatched by the Roman Senate with a great fleet and army to fly flush out and eradicate the large pirate fleets which operated out of the Greek islands and parts of the coastline of Asia Minor in Turkey. This campaign was successful in 67 BC, but he was then appointed to take over the war against King Mithridates of Pontus on the Turkish coast of the Black Sea. In a blistering series of campaigns, Pompey not only finally defeated Mithridates, but then conquered the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, and in 63 BC, he then engaged in a reorganization of the Eastern Mediterranean, which included making the Kingdom of Judea into a client state or vassal. Egypt was now the last remaining major independent in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its status was complicated. The Romans had been interfering in the politics of the Ptolemaic kingdom for almost a century already by the time Cleopatra was born. When her father's predecessor, Ptolemy XI, had died in 80 BC, he had left behind no male heir, and thence had debated annexing Egypt for a time before Cleopatra's father became the new ruler. Still, Romans had taken advantage of the situation to carve off Cyprus from the Ptolemaic dominions. They gave the island to another Ptolemy, an illegitimate half-brother of Ptolemy XII, who ruled the eastern Mediterranean island as a Roman vassal thereafter. They eventually annexed the island in 58 BC. Meanwhile, throughout the 60s BC, as Cleopatra was growing up in Egypt, the issue of potentially annexing Egypt, a region coveted for its agricultural abundance and the riches of Alexandria, was regularly discussed within the Roman Senate, a sign of how precarious the independence of Cleopatra's homeland was, and of her family's position as its rulers. The issue of Rome's influence in Egypt swirled around Cleopatra and This has been a special presentation of Rothschild, brought to you by the views and opinions from the proceeds of our national system. And her family, as she was growing up,
Folks, you want to see some athleticism?
voyaging to the city of Rome in person. This came about owing to a political crisis in Egypt and its former dominions. As we have seen, Rome annexed Cyprus in 58 BC, which had until recently been a long-standing part of the Ptolemaic dominions. This caused a lot of political friction in Egypt and unrest against the rule of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, which culminated in Ptolemy being removed from the throne. Power brokers at the Egyptian court in Alexandria then placed one of his other daughters, Cleopatra's older sister, Berenike, on the throne. The details of a lot of these events are very shadowy. The ancient sources, historians like Cassius Dio and Eusebius, and the geographer Strabo, who was a contemporary of Cleopatra's and lived in Egypt for a while, do not reveal who the court conspirators against her father were. They do allude to the idea that there was some Roman interference that led to Ptolemy being forced off the throne. Nevertheless, Ptolemy decided to now appeal directly to the Roman Senate. He left Egypt and headed for the Eternal City after Berenike and the new government had placed him under pressure to leave Egypt. Interestingly, he brought Cleopatra with him. Why is unclear. They travelled via roads to Greece to Italy, and then finally took up residence at a villa owned by Pompey the Great on the outskirts of the city. They would end up waiting nearly a year to be given an audience before the Roman Senate, where Ptolemy pleaded his case to be restored to his throne. This was the beginning of an extreme set of political machinations and scheming. Back in Egypt, Queen Berenice's government had elected to send its own embassy to Rome with the case again being restored to power. This was led by Dio of Alexandria, a leading philosopher of the time. When he and his embassy arrived, Ptolemy went to work with his allies in Rome to undermine them. Dio was, by all accounts, poisoned. Powerful Roman backers of Ptolemy then argued the case for war to place him back on the Egyptian throne, while others suggested that prophecies and bad omens foretold danger for Rome if it intervened directly in Egypt's military and political affairs. What young Cleopatra must have made of all of this is uncertain. She was still a child of just 12 years. Presumably, her education continued in Rome, and we can imagine that it was during this year spent in the capital of the Republic that she became fully conversant in Latin and developed a greater awareness of Roman manners, customs, and society, information she would utilize in years to come. In the end, the petitioning of her father in Rome did not reach a constructive conclusion, but Pompey nevertheless intervened on his behalf. He instructed Aulus Gabinius, the governor of Syria, and an ally of his, to intervene in Egypt to aid Ptolemy. The deposed king returned east with his daughter, and over the course of several months, Berenice was removed from the throne in Egypt and executed in 55 BC. Ptolemy also purged the court of his opponents with the aid of his Roman allies. In the aftermath of the power struggle, Cleopatra was in a stronger position as a favourite daughter. The whole episode is also important in stressing the ties between Pompey and the Ptolemaic dynasty. A certain Mark Antony, the young Roman military commander who would go on to feature prominently in Cleopatra's story, was also involved in Roman intervention in Egypt in 55 BC. Cleopatra's position as her father's designated heir was indicated in 52 BC, when she was made a regent. He had also stated his wish that she would become a queen after him in his will. He was well into his 60s by this time, and might expect to die before long. Cleopatra would not rule by herself, though. Her young brother, who, as we have seen, was either her full or half-brother, was also designated as King's successor. This arrangement was assigned to allay any concerns about a female ruler succeeding. In any event, if Ptolemy XII died soon, Cleopatra would be the de facto power, as the younger Ptolemy born in the late 6th BC, and was a boy of no more than 10 or 11 when Cleopatra became regent in 52 BC. When her father died less than a year later, in early 51 BC, Cleopatra ascended as Queen Cleopatra VII. She herself was only around 18 years old at the time. Thus she became the more powerful ruler following her father's death. Long-standing Egyptian custom, stretching back many centuries to long before the country had come under Macedonian rule, involved the royal family practicing incestual marriage, and Cleopatra and her younger brother, whose regnal number was Ptolemy XIII, married one another after becoming king and queen. Cleopatra's coronation was a mixed one, reflecting her family's position as a foreign Hellenistic dynasty ruling over Egypt. She ascended in Alexandria, and ruled from the northern city surrounded by a large Greek community of intellectuals and courtiers. At the same time, during her accession, she travelled south to Thebes to part in Egyptian religious rites that signified her accession as Pharaoh of Egypt. This was the ancient capital of Egyptian New Kingdom, back in the Bronze Age of the 2nd millennium BC, synonymous with modern-day Luxor. The ceremony here indicated the way that the Ptolemaic dynasty lived in a dual world of Hellenistic rule and ancient Egyptian custom. The first years of Cleopatra's reign were turbulent. Her kingdom was in a difficult position owing to the civil war that had occurred between her father and her sister Berenike. Roman aid for Ptolemy's cause had come at a price, and the royal dynasty owed millions of silver coins to powerful backers in the Roman world. Another issue was a poor inundation of the river Nile. This was the annual flooding of the Nile, which caused it to deposit rich alluvial soil all along the banks of the river for hundreds of kilometers. The inundation no longer occurs because of the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 20th century, but in ancient times it was key to Egypt's agriculture and its position as a major center of civilization. The failure of the inundation in the first months of Cleopatra's reign caused food shortages and even localized famines. On top of this, the politics of the East had been destabilized when a very large Roman army, led by Marcus Crassus, had been destroyed by the Parthian Empire of Mesopotamia and Persia at the Battle of Carrhae in June 53 BC. The Parthians were making incursions into Rome's eastern territories in the aftermath, leading to Roman calls for assistance from its Egyptian ally. Most worryingly, the intervention in 55 BC had also led to a powerful Roman military faction setting up camp in the country. This was a force of 2,000 Roman legionaries and 500 cavalry, who had arrived as part of Aulus Gabinius' forces from Syria to restore Ptolemy XII to the throne. Afterwards, they remained in Egypt and began to adopt Egyptian customs and play a role in politics. The Gabiniani, as they became known, began to express greater support for Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy XIII, as time went by, a development which made her position more difficult. Cleopatra responded to these issues in a variety of ways. The failure of the inundation and the decline in agricultural produce that it brought about was remedied by stopping Egypt's export of its large agricultural surplus. But this was a delicate balancing act. Egypt was, as Sicily, a breadbasket of Rome, with Egyptian grain being shipped to the capital of the Roman Republic to feed the masses of the rapidly expanding city. In dealing with her own country's needs, Cleopatra had to also try not to annoy the Romans, who depended on Egyptian grain. It would take time to pay back her family's debts, though extensive Egyptian trade into the Red Sea and Indian Ocean was a lucrative source of revenue, as the Egyptians acted as the intermediary for Rome in its acquisition of rare commodities that came from faraway lands in South Asia. The most pressing thing, however, was dealing with the Gabiniani, who had become Ibis. In 50 BC, when Roman emissaries arrived from Syria to try to recruit them for defense of Rome's eastern border against the Parthians, the Gabiniani murdered the Roman diplomats. This placed Cleopatra in a difficult position. She responded by sending the culprits to Syria to be tried there, but this earned her a rebuke for seeming to interfere in Roman affairs. She also tried to marginalize them and to outflank her young brother, who the Gabiniani favored. Archaeological evidence from Egypt dating to early in the reign indicates that she tried to oust her brother, and she appears on some royal inscriptions as the sole ruler. This situation did not last long. appearing as king on the royal inscription. Again, for war between Cleopatra and her younger brother, each with their own supporters within Egypt, was brewing. This was also a period of massive instability in the wider Roman world. Instability which would impact Egypt and Cleopatra before long. Crassus's defeat by the Parthians at Carrhae in 53 BC to an end a political alliance that had existed in Rome since 60 BC, one known as Triumvirate. This had involved Crassus, Pompey, and Gaius Julius Caesar, a slightly younger rival of Pompey's. The establishment of the first triumvirate was just one development in the process whereby Rome's wealthy politicians and generals had started to become excessively powerful. Just over 10 years before Cleopatra was born, this had resulted in a Roman general named Cornelius Sulla briefly becoming dictator of the Roman Republic after he had won a brief civil war against an opposing faction known as the Marians. Sulla had relinquished power and died soon after in retirement. However, his actions had destabilized the Republic even further, alerting all aspiring tyrants that date could be undermined and taken over if a man were audacious enough. Caesar was audacious enough. In the 50s BC, he had become the man of the hour in the Roman Republic, as he engaged in a series of bewildering conquests of Western Europe, conquering what the Romans knew as Gaul and what we know today as France and the Low Countries. He even crossed to Britain to scout out the possibility of conquering the island. As news of Caesar's conquests arrived to Rome, Pompey became yesterday's man. Still, a conservative faction in the Roman Senate coalesced around him and presented him as the defender of the Republic. As Caesar's governor of Gaul neared its end in 50 BC, they tried to revoke him and remove the armies he had under his command. In response, Caesar led his legions south and famously crossed the river Rubicon to march on Rome early in 49 BC. A new civil war had begun, one which Egypt and Cleopatra would soon be pulled into. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey went on for many years, yet the result of it was decided in the late summer of 48 BC. After preparing his Caesar crossed to Greece and met with Pompey's army at Rothschild, a battle which ancient accounts portrayed as a formidable victory for Caesar, who was heavily outnumbered by the Pompeians. He managed to break Pompey's lines and rout them. Thousands of Pompey's men were killed, and many more were captured. Pompey himself escaped to the island of Lesbos and considered his next moves. His cause was not lost. Many supporters of his in places like Hispania and North Africa were willing to continue the fight. Cato the Younger, a prominent senator, had an army in the province of Africa around what is now Tunisia and intended to fight on against Caesar here. Taking stock of this, Pompey decided to sail for Egypt, where he hoped to acquire further support from the Ptolemaic dynasty and presumably link up with Cato's forces to make North Africa the centre of his cause. He would have assumed that he would receive support from Cleopatra, given the generous help he had provided her and her father a decade earlier, when Ptolemy XII had come to Rome looking to be restored to his throne. Pompey sailed first for Cyprus and then to Egypt, arriving there in late September 48 BC. When he arrived to Cleopatra's homeland, he was killed immediately. A party of Roman mercenaries, led by Lucius Septimius, a military officer who had served with Pompey in his meteoric Eastern campaign, in which he had conquered the Seleucid Empire 15 years earlier, stabbed him to death and him, so that the head could be given to Caesar as proof. It is probable that the Ptolemies had ordered his murder in the belief that Caesar's victory was inevitable in the civil war. Pompey's decision to head to Egypt in the aftermath of the Battle of Pharsalus would change the trajectory of Cleopatra's life. Within a few days of Pompey's death, it became apparent that Caesar was about to arrive himself to Egypt, having learned plans were to intercept Pompey before he could establish a new power base in North Africa. When he arrived early in October, he was apparently genuinely upset to learn that Pompey had been killed, and then his body defiled by beheading him. When he came to Alexandria, he settled in the royal palace there and considered his next moves. The civil war was far from over, and despite Pompey's death, Cato and others, including Pompey's son, Sextus Pompeius, would continue to fight on for many years. As he considered his options in the Egyptian capital, Cleopatra saw an opportunity to outflank her brother and claim power, while also preserving the independence of her native kingdom to some extent. She was outside of Alexandria at this time and sent word to Caesar that she wished to meet with him. Then, according to a detailed account left by the Greco-Roman historian Cassius Dio, she, quote, beautified herself so as to appear in the most majestic and at the same time pity-inspiring guise. When she had perfected her schemes, she entered the city and by night, without Ptolemy's knowledge, went into the palace. Caesar, upon seeing her and hearing her speak a few words, was forthwith completely captivated. Before long, it was known that Caesar, who was 52 years of age and married to a woman named Calpurnia back in Rome, had begun a relationship with Cleopatra, who was still only about 21 years of age at that time. Cleopatra's luring of Caesar was doubly necessary, as the power struggle with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, which had been brewing for several years, had broken out into a de facto civil war months earlier. Ptolemy XIII was young, and Cleopatra's real adversary in this was a court eunuch by the name of Pothinus, who had been regent for young Ptolemy since the accession in 50, along with the Gabiniani. There was even a third faction emerging, which supported the claims of Cleopatra's other younger sister, Arsinoe, to the throne. Even as Caesar and Pompey were preparing their forces for the clash at Pharsalus, Cleopatra had been forced to briefly flee from Alexandria into the Levant. After gathering her supporters, she had returned to Egypt. Pompey and then Caesar had consequently arrived, as the Ptolemaic royal family were mired in conflict with one another. Cleopatra's intervention with Caesar makes a lot more sense when we consider how precarious her situation was when she first arrived before him late in 48 BC. Caesar respicions by ordering the execution of Pothinus and declared that Cleopatra was the queen of Egypt. Ptolemy XIII and Arsinoe then joined forces. A remarkable set of events then began. Caesar had only arrived in Egypt with a small contingent of men, and in the winter of 48 BC, the dictator of the Roman Republic ended up trapped in Alexandria with Cleopatra as Ptolemy and Arsinoe laid siege to the capital. They failed to break through and win the city, though, and as the weeks ticked by, reinforcements began arriving in Egypt for Caesar. At a battle in the Nile Delta early in 47 BC, Ptolemy and Arsinoe's cause was defeated. Ptolemy XIII allegedly drowned in the river Nile while trying to flee from the scene of his defeat. Arsinoe only survived because she was exiled to Ionia and took sanctuary to this day. Killing her would have constituted grave breach of religious sanctity. Cleopatra's gambit had worked. With Caesar's aid, she had reclaimed her throne and was the unchallenged ruler of Egypt once again. The issue of female rule was still a problem in Egypt, and in order to shore up her position, Cleopatra installed her other, younger brother as her co-ruler in 47 BC. To confuse matters further, he was, quite unsurprisingly, called Ptolemy as well. Ptolemy XIV, as he now became, was the youngest member of the family and was only around 11 or 12 years old at the time. His exact birth date is not known. A ritual sibling marriage was also entered into. Cleopatra's ambitions were expanding by then. She was Caesar's child. This was an important development. Despite marrying multiple times, Caesar had only had one child from his marriages, a daughter named Julia, who had died in 54 BC, an event which had accelerated the drift to war in the Roman Republic, as she had been married to Pompey as part of the alliance arrangements of the First Triumvirate. Thus, when Cleopatra gave birth to a baby boy in Egypt, sometime in the second half of 47 BC, most likely the late summer or early autumn, it was a quite significant development. Caesar now had a biological male, albeit one born to an Egyptian. The issue was probably serious difficulties getting the Roman political classes to accept the child as his heir, even though he was the unquestioned ruler of Rome by then, having claimed dictatorial powers. The child was named Caesarion. By the time he was born, Caesar had left Egypt to oversee the ongoing war against Cato and other former allies of Pompey. Thus, Cleopatra set off from Egypt with her newborn child in 46 BC to visit Rome. She would spend the next 2 years living. Cleopatra's presence in Rome was viewed poorly by many in the political class of the city. They perceived her as an oriental queen grasping after power. There were also a lot of raised eyebrows about Caesar's relationship with her, and the possibility of him acknowledging Caesarion as an heir. A development like this would have been unthinkable amongst the Roman imperialia, but Caesar had proved time and time again that he was impervious to convention and would not be bound by tradition. This was evident in his refusal to relinquish power. Caesar had claimed the power of dictatores at the start of the civil war against Pompey, on the grounds that the military emergency necessitated emergency powers. But now, with the civil war winding down and his powers set to expire, he proclaimed his wish to become dictator for life. The Romans were averse to the idea of kingship, and there was growing opposition to his decisions. Some people associated Cleopatra with this, claiming she was a bad influence on the Roman general. These included the great Roman orator and rhetorical writer Cicero, who knew Cleopatra and favourably about her. From Cicero's letters, we also learned that Cleopatra might have become pregnant in Rome, though if she did, she lost the baby. The Egyptian queen also lost her lover before too long. On the 15th of March 44 BC, the March festival of the Roman calendar, Caesar was stabbed to death by a cohort of senators in Rome who decided he was intent on becoming a tyrant and needed to be stopped. With his assassination, everything was in flux in the Roman world once again. After the murder of Caesar, Cleopatra only remained in Rome for long enough to have it confirmed that Caesarion had not been named as Caesar's heir in his will. Once this was clear, she left Rome. Her son would be a target for anyone seeking to succeed Caesar as the preeminent figure in the crumbling Roman Republic. She consequently headed back to Egypt and considered her next steps. One of the first measures that she seems to have decided upon was the murder of her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. A royal inscription indicates that he was still alive in late July of 44 BC. He died at some point over the next 8 or 9 weeks, as Caesarion was proclaimed as Cleopatra's new co-ruler at the beginning of September with the regnal name Ptolemy XV, Caesar. There is no evidence as to what happened. Still, the time of his disappearance and the swift devotion of the infant Caesarion to the kingship makes it pretty clear that Cleopatra had poisoned or destroyed in some other way. Thus did Cleopatra bolster her position in Egypt immediately after Caesar's assassination and removed any possibility of Ptolemy XIV becoming the focus of renewed opposition to her rule within Egypt. The assassination of Caesar had set in motion new conflicts within the Roman Republic. The most prominent one was between the supporters of the murdered dictator and the faction of senators who had killed him. This is known as the Liberators' War. As soon as she was back in Egypt and had solidified her control of the throne, Cleopatra was receiving emissaries from both sides, seeking Egypt as an ally in the civil war. Her position was especially important because the war was beginning to focus on Greece and the eastern Mediterranean, where Cleopatra was now in control of the island of Cyprus. Caesar had given the island back to the Ptolemaic royal family in 47 BC, after a brief period of just over a decade of Roman rule there since 58 BC. Cleopatra had control over Egypt and Cyprus, as well as a powerful fleet and substantial army. For obvious reasons, her loyalties lay with those who were seeking to avenge Caesar's killing, and she threw her support behind them. Simultaneously, her position was compromised when the governor of Cyprus, who had been established there after the island was given to her, a man named Serapion, allied with the liberators who had murdered Caesar. This ultimately culminated in yet another plot forming around Cleopatra's remaining sister, Arsinoe, allied with Serapion and others. It climaxed in the murder of Serapion in 41 BC, while Arsinoe was murdered at the Temple of Artemis, where she had sought sanctuary years earlier, a gross violation of religious sanctity. By then, the Liberators' War had come to an end, with Caesar's killers defeated in 2 battles at Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BC. Cleopatra encouraged favored state by siding with the winning faction and remained in control of Cyprus afterwards. As the Liberators' War was underway, the politics of the collapsing Roman Republic were shifting rapidly as Caesar's potential successors positioned themselves to be the next ruler of the state. 3 figures in particular were emerging as potential heirs. The first was Caesar's great-nephew, Octavian, a young man who was only 18 years old when Caesar was assassinated, but who had been named by the dictator as his heir in his will. The others were Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, 2 long-standing allies of Caesar's, who had both served as Magister Equitum, the Master of the Horse, in the years before the assassination, a position as deputy to the dictator. Together, these 3 figures, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, formed a political alliance known as in 43 BC. They aimed to share power within the Republic. Lepidus was soon marginalized, and events thereafter became a power struggle between Octavian and Antony to become Caesar's successor and the ruler of the Roman state. They soon reached a further agreement whereby Octavian would control the western provinces, while Antony held the east. In tandem, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, in 40 BC, and two daughters soon followed. However, even before Antony married Octavia, he had already begun a relationship with Cleopatra, whom Antony had first met in the east, all the way back in 55 BC, when he had been part of the Roman military intervention in Egypt, which restored her father to power. They needed each other, she to preserve her rule in Egypt, while Egypt and its great resources were also vital if Antony was to manage to retain control over the East. Still, as strategic as the relationship was when it began, it seems to have genuinely become a passionate love affair. Children soon followed. Twins, a boy named Alexander Helios and a girl named Cleopatra Selene, were born in 40 BC. Even as Antony was marrying Octavia at that time, while a second son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was born 4 years later, in 36 BC. Cleopatra's relationship had begun back in late 48 BC in a way which was quite circumstantial. Had Pompey not decided to try and regroup in Egypt after his defeat at Pharsalus, Caesar would not have ended up there, and Cleopatra would not have been in a position to woo him. In Antony's case, her actions were possibly far more premeditated, and she had decided that Antony was the most likely figure to emerge victorious from the power struggle following Caesar's assassination. Most contemporaries would have agreed. Lepidus was the weakest partner of the Second Triumvirate, and Octavian was a very young man, with only a limited power base initially. He was looking to strike a decisive blow as well, by launching a great campaign against the Parthian Empire and avenging the destruction of Crassus's army back in 53 BC. Consequently, much of her relationship with Antony over the next several years took place against the backdrop of Antony readying an army of tens of thousands of legionaries and campaigning extensively against the Parthian Empire, primarily within the kingdom of Armenia, a buffer state which the Romans and Parthians were constantly vying for influence within. Cleopatra briefly campaigned with him as far as the eastern Roman border in 36 BC, before returning to Egypt to give birth to their youngest child. As all of this was occurring, there were also growing tensions between Octavian and Antony concerning his relationship with Cleopatra and the public nature of it, even as Antony's wife, Octavian's sister Octavia, was in the eastern Mediterranean and was starting to raise her two daughters with Antony. As Cleopatra and Antony became lovers, and then the main power in the eastern provinces of what remained of the Roman Republic, all manner of stories began to attach themselves to them. Antony was rumoured to be what we would now term an alcoholic, and it was even claimed that he had written a book exclusively on alcohol and drinking. This and many other stories were symbolic of the alleged debauchery and excess of their court in Alexandria. The most famous tale about this is on a wager between the pair as to which one of them could hold the most magnificent banquet. Cleopatra won the bet. Stories of it included a version in Pliny the Elder's huge encyclopedia of knowledge, written a century later, the Natural History, in which he presented a tale about Cleopatra dissolving pearls in her wine and drinking them. Pliny explains it as follows: there have been two pearls that were the largest in the whole of history. Both were owned by Cleopatra. In accordance with previous instructions, the servants placed in front of her only a single vessel containing the strong, rough quality of which cannot pearls. She was at the moment wearing in her ears that remarkable and truly unique work of nature. Antony was full of curiosity to see what in the world she was going to do. She took one earring off and dropped the pearl in the vinegar, and when it was melted, swallowed it. It was a sign of how Cleopatra and Antony were being perceived by the Roman world in their own time, that fanciful stories like this were still circulating a century later. Incidentally, the story of the pearl would become the focus of many paintings of Cleopatra, painted from the 16th century onwards. The story of Cleopatra dissolving the pearl in the goblet may have been entirely fictional. Nevertheless, the very fact that a story like this could develop in the first place and then start circulating widely enough that Pliny the Elder and figures like him were writing about it over 100 years later is in itself is meant to hide a growing sort of decadence and aloofness at Cleopatra and Antony's court in the East, one in which she and her Roman lover were ruling more like Oriental despots than a conservative Roman vassal and the Republic's representative, doing reputational damage to Cleopatra and Antony back west in Rome. The couple did absolutely nothing to alleviate the concerns that many Roman senators might have had about their intentions. Their most egregious action came in 34 BC. Antony was fresh back to the Egyptian capital after a raid into Armenia. King Artavasdes of Armenia allied with the Parthian Empire. The raid had been successful, and Antony returned to the city with the Armenian trader as his captive. He now decided to hold a Roman triumph, a kind of victory parade, which conquering generals were presiding over at Rome. His decision to hold this in Alexandria compounded the perception that Antony now believed he was effectively ruling over an independent kingdom, one which controlled the eastern provinces of the Roman Republic. To make, on the evening of the triumph, Cleopatra and Antony presided over an event known as the Donations of Alexandria. During this, they bestowed Caesarion and their children together with a series of lavish royal titles. Caesarion was stated to be a new king of Egypt. Alexander he was named as king of Armenia and Parthia. His twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, was awarded the title of Queen of Cyrenaica, the Roman name for Libya, while Ptolemy Philadelphus had Syria donated to him and was named as king thereof. This was a striking statement of Cleopatra and Antony's ambitions to rule over the eastern Mediterranean in their own right. The donations of Alexandria were a gift to Octavian far to the west in Rome. He already had the huge advantage of being present in the Eternal City, where he could seek to influence the Senate and other power players in the Republic's politics. Antony was far away in the eastern court in Egypt. There had been rumblings in Rome for years that Antony had been exercising too much independence and was acting like an Oriental king in the East. A special issue was the idea that he and Cleopatra had visitors at her court prostrate themselves on the ground in front of them, an act which the Romans viewed as being beneath their dignity. Now Antony seemed to have confirmed the worst suspicions of many of those in Rome, that perceived that he was intent on splitting the Republic in half and carving off the eastern provinces to rule himself with Cleopatra. Cleopatra featured in many of these criticisms. Many people viewed her as being a manipulative temptress who had first seduced Caesar years earlier and then moved on to his potential successor as soon as he was killed. For Octavian, there was a personal element. Antony had humiliated his sister Octavia through his acts. He left the east and returned to Rome with her 2 young daughters, of which Antony was the father. He added salt to the wound in 32 BC when he finally married Cleopatra without even obtaining a proper legal divorce from Octavia. The time was drawing near when war would break out between the rivals. War finally broke out in 32 BC. Octavian had waited long enough to be able to win over a substantial enough proportion of the Senate to his cause. He was aided by having illegally obtained a copy of Antony's will that had been deposited in the Temple of in Rome, with provisions included expressed desire to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra. When the declaration of war came, it was actually aimed against Cleopatra and Egypt, where it was rumoured she and her lover now intended to establish a senate to rival that at Rome. Whether this was true or a lie concocted to benefit Octavian remains unclear. In any event, Octavian still only managed to obtain the support of a strong bloc of the senators. Many left Rome when the war broke out and went to join Antony's camp. It would be a short civil war, one which has become known as the War of Actium. This is because it was decided in one naval battle at the mouth of the Gulf of Corinth, off the coast of western Greece. Once the war began, Cleopatra and Antony decided to head to Greece to begin building up their forces here for a potential strike against Italy and Rome. At the same time, Octavian and his leading military commander, Marcus Agrippa, moved to prepare a large fleet with which to attack Cleopatra and Antony's armies before they gained the initiative. As Octavian's forces moved towards the Gulf of Corinth, Cleopatra and Antony decided to try and break out of the Gulf and split Octavian's fleet. In one of the largest naval battles in history, involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors, Antony and Cleopatra's armada became divided. Octavian's smaller and more agile galleys also proved more effective, and he and Agrippa won the day. Antony and Cleopatra fled with their remaining ships and men back to Egypt, their plans in disarray. The events which followed have taken on a legendary element to them. As Caesar had chased Pompey to Egypt nearly 2 decades earlier, Octavian prepared to follow Antony to the land. He took his time though and travelled overland by Turkey and the Levant with his forces. Therefore he did not arrive in Egypt until the summer of 30 BC. Despite having nearly a year to prepare for the assault on the country, Cleopatra and Antony were unable to recover from the loss at Actium, where many of their troops had remained stranded on land after they fled with their fleet. These had surrendered, and there was a shift in sentiment in the war, with many former supporters of Antony and Cleopatra now changing sides to back Octavian. When Caesar's great-nephew arrived to Egypt, his troops were tired from the long march, but aided by a separate contingent that had come east from Libya, they won a victory over Antony's troops outside Alexandria in July 30 BC. Following Antony took his own life by stabbing himself in mistaken belief that Cleopatra was already dead. Plutarch, whose Life of Antony is one of the best sources for these events, presents a colourful story where Antony did not live and was brought before Cleopatra, who was alive after all. Cleopatra was subsequently captured by Octavian's troops and defiantly demanded that she would not be paraded through Rome as a defeated prisoner as part of Octavian's triumph. Octavian simply told her that her life would be spared. Unsatisfied with this, Cleopatra decided to join the lover in death. The date is disputed. It probably occurred on the 10th of August 30 BC. meaning that Cleopatra was only about 39 years of age, despite the complex nature of her life up to then. There are a number of varying accounts as to how she took her own life. The most famous one holds that she had her attendants seek out a number of different types of poisonous snakes for her, and she then was bitten by an asp that killed her. However, the more plausible reality is that she simply drank some poison, and it was this which ended her life. Several accounts suggest that she approached her death in an almost ritualistic manner, eating a fine last meal and bathing before she did so. Numerous lavish theories have emerged in the centuries since about what might alternatively have happened. A plausible one is that Octavian could have had her discreetly murdered. Amongst the most implausible is that she died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Afterwards, Octavian permitted a royal burial to occur, and both she and Antony were laid to rest in a mausoleum on the outskirts of Alexandria, the remains of which have never been found by archaeologists. Cleopatra's death and the defeat of her and Antony's cause in the War of Actium brought about one of the key things which she had sought to avoid through her actions over the previous quarter of a century. Egypt was subsumed into the Roman state, as was Cyprus. This was not as inevitable as it initially appears. At this juncture, Rome was still choosing to rule many lands as client states. For instance, Mauritania, in what is now Algeria, Thrace in modern-day Bulgaria, and other regions continued to be ruled as client states until well into the 1st century AD. Even Romans could have done quite easily decades earlier. In Egypt's case, though, the ruling dynasty had been all wiped out by years of internal conflicts. In any event, the Ptolemies were perceived as too great a threat. Despite being his cousin through Caesar, Octavian almost certainly had Caesarion quietly murdered a few weeks after his mother had died. Surprisingly, he spared Cleopatra's children with Antony and sent them to Rome to be brought up there. Both Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus died there in the years that followed. But most historians believe this may have been owing to illness rather than foul play. Cleopatra Selene went on to marry King Juba II of Mauritania, a revered scholar king. What this meant was that Egypt was annexed directly into the Roman state, which Octavian became the first ruler of as Emperor Caesar Augustus after a series of constitutional in 27 BC. His power now unrivaled after the vanquishing of Antony and Cleopatra. Egypt would become a key part of the empire, one which acted as a breadbasket of Rome and Italy, delivering huge shipments of grain and other foodstuffs to the capital. Alexandria featured as the second largest city of the empire for centuries to come, and remained the scientific and intellectual hub of the Greek East. If one wanted to learn about mathematics or medicine in the Roman Empire, then one would study in Alexandria, not Rome. Conquest Egypt also opened up Rome's entry to the Red Sea and the emergence of a thriving trade into the Indian Ocean. Within a few years of the death of Cleopatra and the end of Ptolemaic Egypt, the Romans were sending out expeditions into Arabia to explore the region and establish diplomatic ties to the rulers there, and naval missions to begin establishing trade with India and other faraway lands. Cleopatra has become one of the most iconic female figures from the ancient world. Her name is known all over the world 2 millennia after her own time. The reasons for this are complex. Much of it has to do with her relationships with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and the role she played in the events which led to the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. This meant Greek and Roman saints were credited her in ancient times. She featured in some of the most important historical works written by historians and writers of the Roman world, like Suetonius, Plutarch, Pliny the Elder, and Cassius Dio. This in turn meant that medieval and early modern writers had extensive information available about her and incorporated her into their paintings and sculptures. The story of her dissolving a pearl was especially famed and was the subject of many Renaissance and Baroque paintings. That legacy has transferred to the stage and screen in modern times. Numerous plays, films, and television series have appeared featuring Miss Cleopatra. Perhaps the most revered is William Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, yet undoubtedly the most infamous was the 1963 film Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor as the Queen and Richard Burton as Antony. It ran notoriously over budget and was seen as playing a key role in the decline of the golden age of the Hollywood studio system as a result, although it generally received favourable reviews. Cleopatra was questionably among the most famous women of the ancient world. She appears in the writings of over 50 writers from ancient, with many historians discussing her down to the end of the Roman Empire, and also writers of encyclopedias like Pliny the Elder. That she was so regularly commented on and written about is hardly surprising. Her life was full of significant events. When she was born around 69 BC, Rome was tightening its grip on the eastern Mediterranean, and the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt that her family had ruled over for centuries was already losing its independence. Cleopatra's life was framed around attempting to maintain Egypt's independence and her own family's position as rulers of it. To that end, she first took Julius Caesar as her lover, and then Mark Antony, and had children with both men. There was an element of dumb luck to some of this. Cleopatra might have been calculated in her actions, but it was entirely beyond her control that after his defeat at Pharsalus in 48 BC, Pompey the Great would choose to flee to Egypt. If he had gone elsewhere and Caesar had not ended up in Cleopatra's homeland in pursuit of his rival, history could have been very different. Once she caught his eye and began a relationship with him, her ambitions increased. It is very plausible that she imagined that if Caesar lived long enough, he might have tried to promote Caesarion as his successor one day. When he was assassinated, her plans moved on to Antony. There is every possibility that her relationship with him was based on genuine affection, yet there is no doubting that she also benefited from it politically. The donations of Alexandria of 34 BC and the lavish titles bestowed on her children point to the extent of her ambitions. However, ultimately her luck ran out. In Octavian, she and Antony faced a figure that to a significant degree was actually shrewder than Caesar himself. After biding his time, he convinced the Senate to wage war on Cleopatra in 32 BC and defeated them in a swift war. It seems likely that Cleopatra, faced with the possibility of being brought as a prisoner to Rome after Antony's death, decided to take her own life. What do you think of Cleopatra? Was it possible that she genuinely formed loving relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? Or did she simply seduce two men whom she believed she could utilize to secure both her own position as Queen of Egypt and a degree of continuing autonomy for Egypt in the face of the continuously expanding Roman state? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Is 323 BC. Alexander, who has for the last decade carved out one of the largest empires in human history, is dead. With no mature heir, wars soon erupt as Alexander's commanders and relatives fight over his crumbling empire. One of those commanders, however, does not see an end, but a beginning, and after being made governor of Egypt, eventually proclaims himself Pharaoh, founding a Hellenic dynasty that will rule Egypt for 300 years, ending with the life and reign of Queen Cleopatra. Man's name. The first Pharaoh of Ptolemaic Egypt. The man known to history as King Ptolemy I, Soter of Egypt, was most likely born in 367 BC. We have no clear record of birth, but an ancient source called the Macrobiae, traditionally attributed to the 2nd century AD writer Lucian of Samosata, claims that Ptolemy was 84 years old when he died in 2 AD, which would be around 367 BC. He was born in the kingdom of Macedon in northern Greece, which was in the process of emerging as power in the Greek world at the time of his birth. Ptolemy's father was most likely a Macedonian named Lagus, who came from an undistinguished family in the region of Eodia in western Macedonia. Despite his humble birth, Lagus married Arsinoe, a Macedonian noblewoman who was related to the royal family, the Argead dynasty, which claimed descent from the legendary hero Heracles. There is another theory concerning Ptolemy's parentage, though. The Greek geographer of the 2nd century AD, Pausanias, writing in his famous Description of Greece, a travelogue of the Greek, the Eastern Mediterranean, and of its many texts, history and law, refers to a tradition which indicates that Ptolemy's father, but was instead King Philip II, who rose to become ruler of Macedon in 359 BC. According to this tradition, Arsinoe, Ptolemy's mother, was one of Philip's courtesans and was already pregnant by the time she married Lagus, with Philip's child. However, the claim that Ptolemy was Philip II's illegitimate son, and therefore Alexander the Great's half-brother, was probably invented by Ptolemy much later in his life, when he was trying to establish his claim to succeed Alexander after the latter's premature death. Had Ptolemy really been Alexander's half-brother, the latter would almost certainly have considered him a dynastic rival and a threat to his position. Alexander might well have had him murdered, rather than promoting him to become one of Macedon's most powerful generals. We will see. Instead, Ptolemy became one of Alexander's friends and advisors. Ptolemy is known to have had a brother named Menelaus, who served as a general in Cyprus and later as a priest to the cult of Alexander in Alexandria. But no other siblings are mentioned in the historical records. At the time of Ptolemy's birth, the kingdom of Macedon was emerging as one of the major powers of the Greek world. The ruling Argead dynasty had held dominion over large parts of what is now northern Greece and North Macedonia, going back to the early 7th century BC. But the Macedonians were viewed as barbarous people by the more civilized Greeks of the city-states of the Aegean Sea and the Peloponnese. They fought differently too, often relying on cavalry divisions in their wars, unlike the infantry hoplite soldiers of the Greek polis. But eventually, the culture of city-states like Athens, Sparta, Thebes and Corinth diffused north, and the Macedonians became more entrenched in Greek culture and society. What was more, the rich Greek city-states to the south of Macedon for conquest. In 404 BC, Sparta had finally triumphed over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, a power struggle for hegemony over the Greek world that lasted 27 years and exhausted all sides. Spartan dominant city-states came to an end in 371 BC, when their armies were defeated by the Boeotian League, led by Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra. When King Philip II became ruler of Macedon in 359 BC, he was determined to establish Macedon as the new great power of the Greek world. He built a fearsome war machine by establishing a professional army and adopting new tactics. He developed the formidable Macedonian phalanx, consisting of rows of men armed with a shield and a long spear, known as the sarissa, giving them a range advantage in close quarters combat. Philip also established companion cavalry, a unit made up of high-ranking nobles and close friends of the king, which often proved the decisive factor on the battlefield. After establishing his authority over the tribes of the southern Balkans, such as the Thracians, through military aggression and diplomacy, Philip turned his attentions southwards, and in a series of wars such as the Olynthian War and the Fourth Sacred War, replaced Thebes and the Boeotian League as the dominant power in Central Greece and the Peloponnese. This was the political and military backdrop against which Ptolemy grew up. Like other Macedonian boys, he would have learned how to ride and hunt. He would also have learned to read and write in Greek. It is probable that in 353 BC, when he was 14 years old, Ptolemy was sent to become a royal page at King Philip II's court, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon. It was certainly not as cultivated a place as Athens or Corinth. The Macedonians were known for their heavy drinking and tough upbringing, and many of their customs and traditions appalled the rest of the Greek world, particularly that of polygamy, as Macedonian kings married multiple wives to strengthen alliances at home and abroad. Although the Macedonians spoke Greek, they were called barbarians, perhaps because their accent was difficult to understand for Greeks who lived further south. Here, Ptolemy would have continued his training in the military arts, and by the time of his late teens, may have served in the army during Philip's campaigns of conquest, though this is not explicitly stated. Over time, Ptolemy became a close companion of Philip's son Alexander, who was born in 356 BC, and who would have been only 3 years old when Ptolemy first arrived in Pella. Around 343 BC, Philip hired the famous philosopher Aristotle, the great intellectual successor to Plato at Athens, to come and tutor the teenage Alexander. Ptolemy would have been in his mid-20s at this time, and while there is no record of him studying with Aristotle alongside the Macedonian prince, learning and scholarship would be a key part of Ptolemy's legacy as king of Egypt. Aristotle's arrival to Pella also points towards the manner in which Macedon was becoming the center of a more cosmopolitan kingdom at this time. It is worth briefly pausing here to assess exactly how we know anything at all about Ptolemy and where the gaps in our knowledge lie. The foremost primary source for the first half of his life, down to the time of the death of Alexander the Great, when Ptolemy was in his early to mid-40s, is the Anabasis of Alexander, the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great, and his campaign into Central Asia and India, written by Arrian of Nicomedia, a Greek historian of the 2nd century AD. An anabasis is an ancient Greek name for a lengthy campaign or expedition. Ptolemy necessarily features in the work. In fact, Arrian used Ptolemy's writings as some of his own source material. In his later life, Ptolemy became a historian himself, though, unfortunately, virtually everything he wrote has been lost, with only fragments of his texts surviving, second-hand, in the writing of those like Arrian. A contemporary of Arrian in the Eastern Mediterranean, the historical biographer Plutarch wrote A Life of Demetrius, one of Ptolemy's rivals for power in the decades following the death of Alexander and the fragmentation of his empire. Ptolemy appears regularly in this biography of Demetrius. Closer to Ptolemy's own time, Polybius and Diodorus Siculus, two Greek historians of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC respectively, both composed universal histories of the world, in which the conquests of Alexander and the wars fought by the rulers of the Hellenistic kingdoms, which followed therefrom, are discussed. Again, Ptolemy and his family are discussed therein. Numerous other ancient texts shed light on his reign in Egypt and events there, some almost incidentally so. For instance, the 2nd century BC letter of Aristeas to Philocrates provides one of the most informative accounts of how Alexandria, the capital of Ptolemy's kingdom in Egypt, emerged center of learning in the 3rd century BC. Finally, as with any ruler who reigned for the better part of 40 years in ancient times, there are many inscriptions on temples and civic buildings, and other archaeological sources which can shed light on Ptolemy's reign. Still, it is a great pity that Ptolemy's own histories, like so many other works from the ancient world, have not survived. Back in the middle of the 4th century BC, when he was a young man, Ptolemy began his ascent through the ranks of the Macedonian army in 339 BC in response of Athenian and Theban resistance against Macedon's growing influence over the Greek city-states. King Philip marched on southern Greece. In the summer of 338 BC, the Macedonians faced a Greek coalition force at Chaeronea near Thebes. The 18-year-old Alexander commanded the left wing of the Macedonian army. Ptolemy may have been one of the officers at his side. During the battle, Alexander led the breakthrough against the Sacred Band, a 300-man elite Theban infantry unit. The following year, Philip summoned the Greek states to Corinth and forced them to swear oaths to each other and him, establishing himself as the hegemon of the world. Ptolemy was around 30 years old by then and was a trusted courtier to both Philip and Alexander. However, in 337 BC, he temporarily lost his court position. At that time, Alexander planned to marry the daughter of Pixodorus, the satrap or governor of Caria, in what is now southwestern Turkey. Ptolemy was among 5 of Alexander's advisors who supported the offer against the king's wishes. A furious King Philip responded by banishing those involved from Pella. It is unclear where Ptolemy and his comrades went, but they may have been back in the capital by the time Philip was assassinated by one of his bodyguards in October 336 BC. The circumstances of Philip's death were murky, and it may have been the result of a palace coup. Following his father's untimely 20-year-old Alexander became King Alexander III of Macedon. His military exploits would soon earn him the epitaph Alexander the Great. The young king almost immediately faced a revolt from the southern Greeks, but he quickly defeated these opponents and re-established the League of Corinth. In 335 BC, while consolidating his power at home by purging potential rivals, Alexander led campaigns against the Triballi and the Illyrians to the north and west of Macedonia. Ptolemy is likely to have accompanied Alexander during these campaigns, since he described them in his histories, and portions thereof ended up in Arrian's Anabasis. While Alexander was fighting the Illyrians, he received news that Thebes had once again revolted. He thus marched south with a force of 30,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry, according to Ptolemy's account, again transmitted via Arrian. The Macedonians took the city with heavy casualties after the general Perdiccas, who commanded the vanguard, attacked without awaiting orders from Alexander. Diodorus Siculus does not mention Perdiccas launching his attack prematurely in his account, and it is likely that Ptolemy was seeking to denigrate Perdiccas, who was later one of his major rivals in the bloody civil wars of Alexander. After capturing Thebes, Alexander brutally ordered the city to be razed to the ground. It would not be rebuilt in decades. Alexander then turned his attention towards the invasion of Asia, which his father, Philip, had been planning before he was assassinated. After leaving Greece in the hands of a loyal veteran general named Antipater, in the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led an army of at least 35,000 infantry and cavalry and sailed across the Bosporus to Asia. He then united his forces with 10,000 men under the Macedonian general Parmenion, who had been in Asia Minor since 336 BC. preparing the Macedonian forces there for the coming campaign. Ptolemy served with the infantry in Alexander's army, but his precise rank and role is unclear. Alexander, Ptolemy, and the Macedonian king's other close companions were now setting off to conquer the Persian Empire. Asia Minor, the ancient name for what known as Turkey today, had been ruled since the middle of the 6th century BC by the Persian or Achaemenid, a vast realm ruled by the Persians, a group who had emerged out of Iran or Persia in the 550s BC and rapidly conquered most of the known world. Their empire extended across the modern-day nations and regions of Iran, Iraq, Turkey, the Levant, Egypt, parts of northern Arabia, the Caucasus, and even into parts of Central Asia in Afghanistan and Pakistan, an area then known as The Persians had even tried to conquer mainland Greece, but were famously repulsed during 2 invasion attempts in the early 5th century BC. Now, after 2 centuries of rivalry between the Greeks and the Persians, Macedon had emerged as a power that had united the Greek city-states, making them a power to rival Persia. Alexander consequently embarked in 334 BC on a campaign, or anabasis as Arrian would call it, to conquer Persia, an idea his father had contemplated before his premature death. This would involve clashes with local satraps or governors, minor kings who ruled the provinces of the Persian Empire on behalf of Darius III, the Persian king of kings, who had just succeeded to the throne far away in the Persian capitals, Susa and Persepolis in southern Iran. After crossing the Bosporus, Alexander's army was confronted by an army raised by the local Persian satrap Arcetes at the river Granicus. The Macedonian phalanxes easily overwhelmed the lightly armed Persians, and the Macedonians and Greeks won the first major victory of the campaign that would take Alexander, Ptolemy, and many others to the edge of the known world. Alexander's initial successes alarmed King Darius III. He began to raise a large army in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, to meet the Macedonian threat. As the Persian king marched north to confront Alexander, the 2 sides clashed at Issus in southern Turkey in November 333 BC. While Alexander's army was around 40,000 strong, ancient sources suggest that the Persians had up to 500,000 men, though modern estimates hold that the figure was more plausibly closer to 100,000 men. Again, while Ptolemy left a detailed description of the ensuing battle and would have been a participant, there is no information about where he was deployed or whether he had any men under his command. Knowing he could not engage the enemy in a conventional pitched battle, Alexander led his cavalry straight to Darius's position behind the Persian center. Although the Macedonian infantry came under heavy pressure from the Persians, Alexander did not allow himself to be distracted from his objective and continued his charge towards Darius. As the Macedonian cavalrymen cut their way through his bodyguard, Darius panicked and fled from the field. As Alexander had anticipated, the sight of their king fleeing caused the Persians to lose heart. With the Persian infantry and cavalry retreating in order, the Macedonians advanced and slaughtered many fleas. Although Darius had escaped, Alexander managed to capture a substantial number of the royal entourage, including Darius's mother, wife, and 2 daughters. Alexander demonstrated his magnanimity towards his royal captives and promised to protect them in Darius's absence. After marching south into Syria, Alexander's next target was to neutralize the Persian fleet, anchored at the port city of Tyre. The city was located on an island around half a mile offshore, a natural defensive point. In order to besiege it, Alexander ordered the construction of a causeway to enable his men to attack from land. The Tyrians managed to hold out for 6 months until the summer of 330, but Alexander eventually captured by attacking on both land and sea. Alexander continued down the Mediterranean coast and captured Gaza after a brutal 2-month siege. His next target was Egypt, then a province of the Persian Empire governed by the satrap Mazaches. Although the Persians had ruled Egypt for almost 2 centuries, Persian rule remained unpopular, and Mazaches knew he could not resist, and duly surrendered to Alexander at the ancient capital of Memphis, to the south of present-day Cairo. Alexander was careful not to make Mazaches' mistake, and treated Egyptian customs and religion with respect. Alexander gained popularity by restoring old Egyptian temples, and although he formally crowned Pharaoh, he made sacrifices to Egyptian gods and assumed the titles and responsibilities associated with kingship in Egypt. Alexander was determined to make a visit to the Oracle of Amun-Ra in the Siwa oasis, situated hundreds of miles to the west, near the modern-day Libya and Egypt. As Amun-Ra was the creator god of the Egyptian pantheon, the Greeks associated him with Zeus, their most important deity, and called him Zeus Ammon. Ptolemy was among the group of companions whom Alexander chose to accompany him on his journey from Memphis to the Siwa oasis. The party took a circuitous route via the Nile Delta and the northern coast of Egypt, where the king founded a city named Alexandria. After marching west to the vicinity of what is now El Alamein, they turned south and made for the oracle. After consulting the priest, Alexander announced to his companions he was the son of Zeus Ammon. All of this was Ptolemy's first experience of the land. He and his family would come to rule for a period of nearly 3 centuries. While Alexander was in Egypt, the king of Persia had raised another large army to confront the Macedonian conqueror. Armies met at the Battle of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq on the 1st of October 331 BC. Alexander was once again heavily outnumbered and employed similar tactics as at Issus. On this occasion, he ordered his right flank to fall back, enticing the Persian cavalry commander Bessus to launch a premature attack. Bessus left a small gap in the Persian line, which Alexander immediately exploited, leading his cavalry towards Darius. As the Persian king turned to flee once again, Alexander and his horse off in pursuit, but soon returned to the battlefield at Gaugamela to relieve Parmenion on the Macedonian left, who had been struggling to hold back the numerically superior Persian infantry commanded by Mazaeus, satrap of Babylon. By the time Alexander returned, the crisis was over as Mazaeus' men realized their king had abandoned them once again, giving Parmenion the opportunity to counterattack. Following his victory at Gaugamela, Alexander marched south to occupy Babylon, where he decided to maintain the satrapy system and confirmed Mazaeus in his office. He then proceeded southeast towards the Persian heartland of Persis, taking possession of the royal capital of Susa in December. Alexander's next target was the city of Persepolis. As Darius attempted to raise a third army, Ariobarzanes, satrap of Persis, defended a pass over the Zagros Mountains, known as the Persian Gates. Confined to a narrow defile, Alexander's men were cut down by the defending Persians. Alexander's progress was stalled for a month, until a local shepherd informed him of a mountain path that would enable him to circumvent Ariobarzanes' position. Ptolemy claimed that Alexander gave him command of 3,000 men to attack the enemy in the center of the pass, while the king marched his men behind Ariobarzanes. However, Arrian suggests that Ptolemy was deployed further in the rear and entrusted to prevent any escaping. By late January 330, Alexander's army arrived in Persepolis. Alexander ordered the destruction of palace buildings associated with Xerxes the Great, the Persian king who had invaded Greece a century and a half earlier, during which the city of Athens had been sacked. According to one account, the destruction of Persepolis was encouraged by an Athenian woman in the Macedonian entourage named Thais, who would later become one of Ptolemy's wives. After 3 months in Persepolis, Alexander continued the chase for Darius, who was now seeking to raise a new army in Central Asia. Darius's string of military failures encouraged a rebellion by his commander Bessus, who had the King of Kings killed before proclaiming himself as King Artaxerxes V. Cautious of irritating local sentiment, when he arrived in Central Asia, Alexander ordered Darius's body to be buried in Persepolis with full ceremonial honors. As Alexander prepared to take on Bessus, he was himself the target of an assassination plot instigated by a friend, Dimnos. Although the plot had been known of to Philotas, Parmenion's son and commander of the companion cavalry, he did not tell Alexander about it. Once Alexander learned both of the plots and Philotas's knowledge of it, he eliminated the conspirators and executed both Philotas and Parmenion for treason. Alexander's primary motivation in hating the pair was probably because they had criticized the king for his growing adherence to Persian customs over Greek ones. Alexander responded by promoting trusted friends to senior positions. His closest companion, Hephaestion, became one of the commanders of the companion cavalry, while Ptolemy obtained a more senior position. By now in his mid-30s, Ptolemy had played a role in the commanding of the Macedonian forces throughout the campaign to conquer the Persian Empire. However, it is difficult to be sure exactly how senior his position was during these years. The available focus, for obvious reasons, on Alexander, even where they are derived from Ptolemy's histories. Furthermore, even where they do mention Ptolemy, it's debatable how much we can trust them. Ptolemy would have been keen, in later years, to stress his own seniority amongst the companions of Alexander, and any source, like Arrian, that relied on his own writings might have fallen prey to believing Ptolemy's own exaggerations. These issues aside, it does seem relatively clear that Alexander's elimination of Parmenion and Philotas enabled Ptolemy to rise to a more prominent position within the Macedonian leadership in 330 BC. In the months that followed, Alexander's army braced the difficult conditions to cross the Hindu Kush in the winter of 330 BC and 329 BC, forcing retreat to Sogdiana in what is now Uzbekistan. After taking the city of Balkh, Alexander prepared to cross the Oxus River, now known as the Amu Darya, into Sogdiana. Although Bessus managed to destroy the boats on the river to prevent Alexander from making his crossing, the latter issued a message to the remaining Persian armies, offering friendship with anyone who could bring Bessus to him as a captive. 2 Sogdian chieftains, named Spitimenes and Dataphenes, duly informed Alexander they had arrested Bessus. The king gave Ptolemy his first independent command by sending him at the head of some 5,000 men to take Bessus into custody. Ptolemy delivered the Persian usurper to Alexander, who sent him to Balkh, where he had his nose and ears cut off before being executed the following year. Despite surrendering Bessus, Spitamenes and Dataphanes soon turned against Alexander and began waging a guerrilla war in the mountains of Central Asia. Alexander responded with a brutal pacification campaign, in the course of which he appointed Ptolemy as commander of one of the detachments which worked to restore order in the region. In the meantime, Alexander continued to be criticized by his companions for his embrace of Eastern customs and his insistence on remaining in Asia. Many of his followers wanted to return home. They had marched east to conquer the Persian Empire, but now, having done so, their king seemed to be intent on wandering even further east to lands few Greeks or Macedonians had ever heard of, let alone visited. The growing resentment boiled over in the summer of 328 BC, when Alexander's old friend Clytus saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus River, launched into a drunken rant targeted at Alexander and the companions like Ptolemy, who sycophantically praised his exploits. As the furious Alexander rushed up to Clytus, Ptolemy intervened and dragged the latter out of the room. But as the king continued to shout his curses, Clytus broke away from Ptolemy and ran back to continue the argument with Alexander. The king immediately grabbed a spear from one of his bodyguards and killed Clytus on the spot. As the unrest grew towards Alexander's actions, it is very possible that Ptolemy's stock grew in the king's eyes, as he established himself as an unflinching supporter of Alexander's plans. This would leave Ptolemy in a good position when the time came a few years later for a successor to emerge. The campaign against Dataphanes and Spitamenes was otherwise coming to an end in Central Asia. Alexander's men performed an extraordinary feat in capturing a fortress known as the Sogdian Rock by scaling up a sheer cliff face under the cover of darkness. Ptolemy played an important role in the siege of the equally formidable rock of Chorienes, protected by a deep ravine which Alexander sought to bridge. Ptolemy was one of 3 men responsible for the night operations which enabled Alexander to build a wooden bridge and deploy his siege machines. In the spring of 327 BC, Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. The decision caused further dissension among some of Alexander's friends, who wanted him a Greek woman. Ptolemy seems to have acted as intelligencer for Alexander during this period, bringing information to the king about potential plots against him. Despite the unrest, Alexander was determined to march further east to India, and in mid-327 BC, he divided his army into 2 columns and marched towards the Indus River. Ptolemy accompanied Alexander as he led his column through the Swat Valley, where they faced formidable resistance from the Aspasian peoples. During the next phase of the campaign, Ptolemy led Alexander's left flank at the siege of Arrhegium, while Leonatus, another of Alexander's bodyguards, commanded the Macedonian right. In Ptolemy's later account, Alexander and Leonatus swiftly overcame enemy resistance, but he himself faced a tougher challenge before he eventually. During the final stage of his march towards the Indus Valley, Alexander besieged several fortresses belonging to the Assassine people. During the siege of Massaga, the Macedonians killed the local king and prompted the queen to offer her surrender. Ptolemy played a prominent role at the final siege of the campaign against the mountaintop fortress of Aeornus. He was stationed at a summit on the opposite side of the ravine. Alexander bridged it in order to take the position. Alexander quickly moved on towards the Hydaspes River to do battle with Porus, a neighboring Indian prince who resisted Alexander's rule. Ptolemy accompanied Alexander as he led a detachment on a flank attack, but the movement was poorly executed, and Alexander found himself facing the entire enemy army. Nevertheless, he won a decisive victory, captured Porus, and made him his vassal. Although Alexander continued to push east, his men were no longer willing to follow him, and he was finally persuaded to turn back. Alexander wanted to reach the Indian Ocean and build a fleet at the Hydaspes, but after the fleet was damaged in a storm, he decided to besiege the city of Mali in the Punjab. Alexander and a handful of senior officers scaled the wall of the enemy citadel, but were soon stranded when the ladders collapsed beneath them. During this engagement, the king was struck by an arrow in his neck and was shielded by an officer named Bucastus, while the rest of the army stormed the gates and massacred the garrison before they could inflict further damage. Arrian refers to accounts of Ptolemy being the man responsible for shielding Alexander. It was from this that he allegedly acquired his nickname, Soter, meaning savior. He has become known by this ever since, establishing the name Ptolemy Soter. It also set a precedent whereby members of the Ptolemaic dynasty he founded in Egypt acquired cognomens that were added to their regnal name. The acquisition of the Soter name was one of the last actions of the India campaign. Not long after this, Alexander, Ptolemy, and the other Macedonians turned back westwards for Persia. Back in Persia at Susa, in the early spring of 324 BC, Alexander organized a mass marriage ceremony between his senior officers and companions and numerous Persian women. The idea here was to mingle the Macedonian and Persian nobility in ways which would create a more homogeneous empire over the coming decades. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses, while Ptolemy married Artacama, the daughter of a Persian nobleman named Artabazus. Ptolemy does not appear to have been very fond of his Persian wife, and may have quickly divorced her after Alexander's death. Matters deteriorated further thereafter. In the summer of 324 BC, after the king had dismissed his veteran army and allowed them to return home as they had hoped, Alexander suffered a small tragedy with the death of Christian. He responded by an even heavier drinking than he was already used to. Alexander appointed Perdiccas as his new second-in-command and sent him to convey Hephaestion's body to Babylon, where a grand funeral ceremony was held. In early 323 BC, Alexander went to Babylon and prepared to lead a campaign into the Arabian Peninsula. While Alexander had suffered several battle wounds, some of which threatened to kill him, he had otherwise been healthy. But in mid-BC, he suddenly fell ill and died in mid-June, a few weeks short of his 33rd day. While Alexander had a 4-year-old son named Heracles to his Persian mistress Barsine, the young boy's illegitimate birth excluded him from the succession. Alexander's Bactrian wife, Roxana, was several months pregnant, but there was no guarantee that she would have a son who would live. In any event, there was no way that the enormous empire which Alexander had built over the preceding decade could be held together during the long minority rule of a child that was not even born yet. The question of how to reach a political settlement following Alexander's suspicious death would frame the rest of Ptolemy's life. During his illness, Alexander summoned Perdiccas to his side and gave him his signet ring to deputize for him. According to Ptolemy's later account, as Alexander's condition deteriorated, his generals gathered at his bedside who would succeed him, to which the king answered, quote, "To the best." He died shortly thereafter. This prophetic anecdote has been challenged by modern historians, who note that Alexander had an elder half-brother, Arrhidaeus, who could be expected to continue the Argead royal line, although he suffered from some form of mental incapacitation, which meant that he would only be able to execute royal duties with the regency. Due to his position as Alexander's deputy, Perdiccas took charge of affairs and chaired a meeting of Alexander's generals and bodyguards to decide on the succession question. With himself in mind, Perdiccas proposed a regency which would last until Roxana's child, presumed to be a son, came of age. Others put forward their claims to act as regent. Ptolemy spoke against all the proposed candidates at a council of equals, who would work together to govern the empire as satraps. This and other plans were rejected until one of those gathered spoke in favor of Arrhidaeus, upon which an officer named Maliga brought Arrhidaeus into the meeting and proclaimed him as King Philip III. Eventually, the parties agreed to a compromise in which Arrhidaeus would be king. If Roxana subsequently gave birth to a son, the two would be joint rulers. Perdiccas would remain as second in command, but Maliga would serve as his deputy. Almost immediately, Perdiccas disregarded the arrangement by sidelining King Philip and eliminating Maliga. He then declared himself regent to Philip III and agreed to Ptolemy's proposal to divide the empire into satrapies, which he believed would allow him to isolate his rivals and eliminate them one by one. Of this arrangement, Ptolemy became satrap of Egypt. Ptolemy had suddenly emerged as the ruler of one of the rich cultured parts of Alexander's recently assembled empire. The River Nile ensured that Egypt was a fertile land, one which had been the cradle of one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. At the same time, the surrounding desert and the marshes of the Nile Delta made the country easier to defend. Here, Ptolemy would be able to build up his power in the months and years ahead, as his rivals inevitably came to blows elsewhere. Wars were not slow in breaking out. Following Alexander's death, the Greeks almost immediately rose up against Macedonian rule, prompting Antipater and Craterus, two of the other former companions of Alexander, to join forces to defeat the uprising and impose direct rule. Perdiccas was the army that Antipater and Craterus had under their command and prepared to do battle with them. Ptolemy remained in Babylon with Perdiccas for several months, during which time Roxana gave birth to a son named Alexander, duly proclaimed as King Alexander IV, alongside his half-uncle Philip III, in accordance with the earlier agreement. Ptolemy probably arrived in Egypt in 322 BC. As ruler of Egypt, Ptolemy followed Alexander's example and promoted the traditional religion of the country. Ptolemy initially governed Egypt from Memphis, but would later relocate to Alexandria, which was still under construction at the start of his reign. To strengthen his position on the Mediterranean coast, he formed an alliance with the people of the island of Cyprus, and also took advantage of a political dispute in Cyrenaica, in what is now Libya, to bring that region under Egyptian control. In the summer of 321 BC, Ptolemy received information that after spending 2 years preparing a fabulous casket and carriage, Perdiccas was preparing to finally transport Alexander's body to Macedonia from Mesopotamia. In September 321 BC, Ptolemy executed an audacious plan to steal the king's remains at Damascus, and justified his action by claiming that Alexander's final wishes were to be buried at Dus Ammon, in the sea oasis, which the great king had visited while in Egypt back in 331 BC. However, after seizing the body, Ptolemy made no effort to take the late king's body to the oracle, and instead placed it in a temporary tomb in Memphis before transferring it to Alexandria to strengthen his legitimacy. Ptolemy's kidnapping of Alexandria was an open challenge to Perdiccas' authority as a regent, and he responded by launching an invasion of Egypt in mid-320 BC in the name of the two kings, who were part of his entourage. Although his army began to melt away almost immediately after crossing the Egyptian frontier, Perdiccas made his way towards Memphis and attacked the nearby fort of the Camels. But Ptolemy proved equal to the task and defended the fort from its walls. Perdiccas then marched directly on Memphis, but his men struggled to swim across the Nile, and many drowned in their heavy armor. After, Perdiccas ordered to withdraw. Those who had already swum across to the far bank noticed the plight of their drowned comrades and took off their armor to swim back. Many of them were allegedly eaten by crocodiles. With his army in disarray, Perdiccas was soon stabbed to death by two of his subordinates, Seleucus and Python. Ptolemy treated Perdiccas' men magnanimously and presented gifts to the joint kings Philip and Alexander, which led Philip III to confirm his status as satrap of Egypt. Ptolemy was offered the regency, but refused and remained in Egypt with Alexander's body, while the two kings departed for Macedonia. Following Perdiccas' death, Alexander's surviving successors met at Tripoli in Syria in 320 BC to work out a new arrangement. Alexander IV was still an infant, and Philip III was not considered capable of it right. A new regent was needed. The meeting was chaired by Antipater, a grand old man of around 80 years of age by then. It was agreed that he would become regent, but this was only a temporary solution given Antipater's age. His ally Antigonus, previously only satrap of Phrygia in northern Asia Minor, inherited Perdiccas' armies in Asia, while Perdiccas' assassin Seleucus was named satrap of Babylon. Ptolemy was confirmed as satrap of Egypt and strengthened his ties to Antipater by marrying his daughter Eurydice in 320 BC. 3 years later, Ptolemy would also marry her niece, as he firmly adopted the polygamy that Alexander had promoted. Ptolemy seems to have had at least 4 wives. The following year, the elderly Antipater died. His son, Cassander, would eventually emerge as his successor, as regent in Greece and Macedon, who soon seized Olympias, its mother, and executed her. He also placed the infant king Alexander IV and Roxana under house arrest, while publicly presenting himself as their protector. Philip III was also key to these events. In the 310s BC, the former companions of Alexander and other figures like Cassander and Seleucus, who had not really known the Macedonian king, but who were now emerging as powerful figures in civil war, dispensed with the pretense that they were trying to govern Alexander's empire as custodians of it until his son came of age to succeed him. They were clearly all trying to acquire their own slice of the empire to rule themselves. The civil wars which began during this time are known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Diadochi meaning successors in ancient Greek. These wars would last for 4 decades, the entirety of the rest of Ptolemy's life. In the years that followed, Antigonus took control of Mesopotamia and Syria and adjoining lands, forcing Seleucus to flee to Ptolemy for protection, warning him that Antigonus planned to become sole ruler of Alexander's empire and was planning an invasion of Egypt. Ptolemy formed alliance with Cassander and Lysimachus, satrap of Thrace, in 315 BC, and demanded that Seleucus be reinstated in Mesopotamia. It was probably at this time that Ptolemy moved his capital from Memphis to Alexandria, which was more strategically located in northern Egypt. While Antigonus attempted to use diplomatic means to undermine Ptolemy's allies in Cyprus, in 313 BC, an Egyptian fleet led by Seleucus defeated Antigonus' fleet and in control of the whole island. In late 312 BC, Ptolemy fought a battle against Antigonus' forces near Gaza, during which Ptolemy effectively neutralized the enemy's war elephants by attacking them from below with javelins, adopting a tactic Alexander had used against Indian war elephants at the Battle of Mehadaspes. The victorious Ptolemy captured 8,000 enemy troops and soon retook Gaza. These gains were short-lived, as Antigonus prepared to join forces with his son to take their revenge on Ptolemy. Rather than risk a battle, Ptolemy retreated back to Egypt. By 311 BC, with all the combatants exhausted, Seleucus was able to retake Babylon and declare himself General of Asia in opposition to Antigonus. Following a new round of peace negotiations, Antigonus lost much of his territory. A temporary ceasefire obtained thereafter. As none of the Diadochi to give up their lands, there were no complaints when Cassander arranged for Alexander IV and his mother Roxana to be poisoned in 310 BC. With Alexander IV's death, the Argead dynasty, which had ruled Macedonia for over 3 centuries, was extinguished. The Diadochi, like Ptolemy, were now free to give up the pretense that they were merely ruling their territories as satraps that would one day hand over power to Alexander IV when he came of age. With this, we can consider that Ptolemy had emerged fully as King Ptolemy I of Egypt. His regnal name is usually given as King Ptolemy I Soter, using the cognomen he had acquired years earlier for saving the life of Alexander the Great. Everyone understood that the peace agreement of 311 BC was merely a temporary lull, as all parties prepared for the renewal of conflict. Ptolemy was secure in Egypt, and he promoted his cause as Alexander's successor by placing Alexander's remains at the center of his new capital of Alexandria. After its foundation by Alexander in April 331 BC, the city was being built according to the designs of the architect Dinocrates of Rhodes, who connected the new city to the nearby island of Pharos via a causeway. The early building work was primarily focused on defense and trade. After taking Alexander's body to Alexandria, Ptolemy built a mausoleum known as the Sema, and set up a religious cult to honor Alexander as a god. This structure was replaced a century later by a new mausoleum built by Ptolemy IV, which was integrated into the palace complex and served as the royal tomb of the whole Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy would also found the city of Ptolemais near Thebes, which is capital of southern Upper Egypt, together with Alexandria and the nearby trading port of Naucratis. Ptolemais was one of 3 cities in Egypt which enjoyed the status of a Greek state and had its own elected officials. While Alexander the Great had ordered the building of dozens of cities called Alexandria while he was undertaking his campaigns, the Alexandria he founded in northern Egypt would grow to become the most preeminent of these urban centers under the patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty. While he would build Alexandria into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, Ptolemy's ambitions extended far beyond Egypt. In 310 BC, After a period of consolidation, during which he solidified his control over Egypt and strengthened his army, he resumed hostilities in the Wars of the Diadochi. He sent his forces against Antigonus, though with mixed success. The following year, in 309 BC, Ptolemy personally led an army to occupy the western coast of Asia Minor, and the following year he was challenging Cassander in Greece, seeking not only to bring the League of Corinth under his control, but to conquer his native Macedonia. At around this time, Ptolemy circulated a document he claimed to be Alexander's will, which stipulated that his full sister Cleopatra should marry Ptolemy. Cleopatra accepted the proposal, but was soon put to death by Antigonus before she could do so. It has been speculated that it was only after learning of Cleopatra's demise that Ptolemy came up with the idea of claiming that he was a son of King Philip II of Macedon, and thus a half-brother of the deceased Alexander. Moreover, his decision to launch a campaign against Cassander in Greece and Macedon indicates that he aspired to unite all of Alexander's former empire under his rule. Despite these claims, though, Ptolemy found little support among the Greeks and returned to Egypt, though he remained in partial control of the key city of Corinth and had strengthened his dominance of the eastern Mediterranean. The wars over the next several years centered on the eastern Mediterranean and control over territories like the islands of Rhodes and Cyprus, the latter of which Ptolemy had established control of early on in the Wars of the Diadochi. For instance, Antigonus sent his son Demetrius to try and take control of Athens in 307 BC, and then later to attack Cyprus. The latter expedition proved successful, and Ptolemy temporarily lost control. Fresh from his success, in 306 BC, both Antigonus and Demetrius assumed the title of king. The likes of Ptolemy and Cassander had also been de facto kings, and soon followed suit and began circulating coins with their likenesses. Despite his defeat at sea off Cyprus, Ptolemy rallied and set up his camp at Pelusium, near present-day Port Said, where he awaited a large invasion force of more than 80,000 men, under the joint command of Antigonus and Demetrius. A combination of poor weather and Ptolemy's tactic of encouraging enemy troops to defect by offerings forced Antigonus and Demetrius to turn. It is possible that it was at this time that Ptolemy began formally using the epithet of Soter that he had acquired years earlier, though it is more likely that Ptolemy began using this name officially in 304 BC, after he helped to defend Rhodes from invasion by Demetrius, following which the thankful Rhodians set up a religious cult in Ptolemy's honor. After his failure to take Rhodes, Demetrius strengthened his position in Greece at the expense of Cassander. Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Seleucus renewed their alliance with Cassander and attacked Antigonus in Asia Minor, forcing Antigonus to recall his son from Greece, while Ptolemy recaptured Amnesia. In 301 BC, Lysimachus led a coalition army victory against Antigonus and Demetrius at the Phrygian town of Ipsus, during which Antigonus was killed. Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, who by then were the only three survivors among Alexander's original successors, amongst whom Seleucus had only ever had a tenuous link to the dead king, proceeded to divide Antigonus's vast domain among themselves. Lysimachus received the western half of Asia Minor. Seleucus took over the remainder of Antigonus's territory, extending all the way to Central Asia. Ptolemy's gains in Syria and the Levant were relatively modest, and his relations with Seleucus were strained by a dispute over possession of Phoenicia, in particular the wealthy of Tyre and Sidon. During the ensuing diplomatic reshuffle of the early 290s BC, Ptolemy established marriage ties to Lysimachus, while Seleucus reached out to Demetrius. Not long afterwards, Seleucus and Demetrius unexpectedly sought a reconciliation with Ptolemy. As part of the deal, Demetrius sent his ally King Pyrrhus of Epirus to Alexandria as a hostage for his good behavior. Ptolemy and Demetrius were soon at war again following developments in Greece, where Cassander had died in 297 BC. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Philip IV, who ruled for a few months before his own death, leaving them jointly ruled by Cassander's younger sons, Antipater I and Alexander V. Ptolemy responded by restoring Pyrrhus to his throne at Epirus, which he had lost after the Battle of Ipsus. Localia, Epirus bordered Macedonia to the west, enabling Pyrrhus to intervene on behalf of Macedonia. Demetrius would also become embroiled in these conflicts, eventually emerging as king there in 294 BC. By this time, the interminable wars of the Diadochi were entering their final stage. There was only so long that all the parties involved could maintain large armies for, and new concerns were emerging in the west, where Pyrrhus of Epirus would soon be drawn to defend the Greeks of southern Italy against an emerging power there, the Roman Republic. For his part, Ptolemy took advantage of Demetrius' absence in Macedonia by retaking control of the eastern Mediterranean. He captured Cyprus, which would thereafter remain a Ptolemaic possession until the 1st century BC. Ptolemy also took control of the Cycladic islands in the Aegean Sea, who honored him by establishing their own cult of Ptolemy Soter. At around the same time, he seized the rich trading cities of Sidon and Tyre in the Levant, as well as parts of Asia Minor that remained loyal to Demetrius. After a couple of years of relative peace, Demetrius built up an army of some 100,000 men to invade Asia and was ready to strike by 288 BC. In response, Ptolemy invaded Greece, while Lysimachus and Pyrrhus launched a two-pronged attack on Macedonia from east and west and divided the kingdom between each other. Although Demetrius took control of the Peloponnese and laid siege to Athens in 287 BC, Ptolemy and Pyrrhus supported the Athenians and expelled Demetrius from Greece. Demetrius crossed into Asia Minor and seized a few towns, but was eventually defeated in battle in 285 BC. He sought refuge with Seleucus, but was imprisoned by him and died in captivity in 283 BC. Thus, the wars of the Diadochi came to an end in the late 280s BC, with Ptolemy having carved out a position as king of Egypt, who also controlled Cyrenaica in Libya, the island of Cyprus, the Sinai Peninsula, large parts of the Levant, and some of the other islands of the Aegean Sea. The other two great successor states were the Dominions, which became known as the Seleucid Empire and covered Syria, Mesopotamia, some of Persia, and Asia Minor, while the Kingdom of Macedon would survive as the weaker of the major successor states. Many parts of Alexander's former empire became independent again, notably the kingdoms of Central Asia and the Greek city-states of the mainland. By the time the wars of the Diadochi were winding down, Ptolemy was around 80 years old and in declining health. He had spent much of his career following Alexander's death in conflict with his rivals, interspersed with very brief periods of peace and tranquility, lasting no more than a couple of years at a time. Nevertheless, while the ancients offer little information as to how Ptolemy approached state administration, The kingdom enjoyed stability and prosperity during his rule. Ptolemy was careful to balance the interests of the Macedonian and the native Egyptian populations. While he moved his capital to Alexandria and founded Ptolemais to extend his influence further up the Nile Valley, he recognized that he had to respect Egyptian traditions and made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods. He developed the cult of the god Serapis as a dual Greco-Egyptian deity in particular. This was symptomatic of his entire method of ruling. Ptolemy established a dual Hellenistic kingdom where Greeks and Macedons intermingled with Egyptians. The Greeks were quite clearly the ruling elite, but as the arts and architecture of the Ptolemaic era makes clear, they adapted to local conditions. As a result, we find many friezes on temple walls, statues and death masks from the time, which depict Ptolemy and his successors in the traditional guise of the Egyptian pharaohs. Nevertheless, Greek was the language of state administration. Greek and Macedonian officials held the most important offices, and during his wars, Ptolemy tended to favor Macedonian and Greek troops over native Egyptians. Alexandria became the symbol of the new kingdom. This cosmopolitan city, home to large populations of Greeks, Jews, Egyptians, and other groups from Asia, Europe, and Africa. There is a debate as to whether Ptolemy founded the museum and library of Alexandria, or if this was his son and successor Ptolemy II, born around 309 BC to Ptolemy and his wife Berenice. The library, which was part of the Museion, a complex of religious and civic buildings in central Alexandria, attracted scholars from all over the Mediterranean world. The basis for them was probably laid down by Ptolemy I in the 290s or 280s BC, though they real fruition under Ptolemy II. While Ptolemy preferred to allow scholars the independence to pursue their own research, he made an exception for the mathematician Euclid, who wrote his seminal Elements, one of the foundational texts in the field of geometry and mathematics, while living in Alexandria around 300 BC under the king's patronage. Construction of the library remained incomplete at the end of Ptolemy's reign, and it was up to his son Ptolemy II to supervise its completion, organize the institution as the repository of all scholarship in the known world. Ptolemy I was also responsible for the construction of the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The completed structure stood at over 110 meters tall, the tallest man-made structure in the world at the time, with the exception of the pyramids of Giza. Equipped with a reflective mirror at daytime and a burning furnace at night, the light was visible up to 40 miles away, enabling approaching ships to enter the city's harbor safely. In wartime, the structure could also be used to serve as a warning for approaching enemy ships. While Ptolemy was responsible for the design and work may have started in 297 BC, it was also unfinished at his death and completed by his successor. Ptolemy was around 84 years old when he died, but as he used 2 different dating systems for his rule, it is unclear whether he died in 283 BC or 282 BC. He was succeeded by his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, then in his early 20s, whose mother Berenice was Ptolemy's 4th and most influential wife. Ptolemy II may already have been installed as his father's joint ruler in 285 BC, not long after displacing his elder half-brother Ptolemy Coronis, the son of Eurydice, as Ptolemy I's preferred successor. At the time of Ptolemy I's death, his realm was at its greatest extent, though the wars of the successors was not yet completely over. Seleucus' death in 281 BC marked the end of war's successors, 1 years after Alexander's death. In 276 BC, Demetrius' son Antigonus Gonatas, grandson of the first Antigonus, defeated the Gauls and established the Antigonid dynasty, which ruled Macedonia and parts of Greece until its conquest by Rome in 168 BC. The Seleucid Empire lasted until 63 BC, when it too was conquered by the Roman general Pompey the Great, leaving Ptolemaic Egypt as the longest-lived of the successor states to the empire of Alexander the Great. Its demise is well known, with Queen Cleopatra VII becoming the lover of Caesar and Mark Antony in succession, as she sought to manage her kingdom's relationship with the now all-powerful Roman Republic. Her demise in 30 BC, following the civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's successor, ushered in the birth of the Roman Empire. Thus, the Ptolemaic dynasty that Ptolemy founded was bookended on one side by the demise of the short-lived empire of Alexander the Great, and on the other by the birth of the Roman Empire. Ptolemy I Soter began his long life in the remoteness of Western Macedonia and ended it as King of Egypt. His connections with the Macedonian elite through his mother enabled him to become an important player at court and a trusted friend of Alexander the Great. But while he served as Alexander's bodyguard and saw action in most of his battles, it is debatable how senior his position during Alexander's lifetime. He may have exaggerated how close he was to the king in later years, and his propaganda was then absorbed by writers like Arrian, who used Ptolemy's own histories when writing their accounts of the conquests of Alexander. Ptolemy came to the fore following Alexander's death, firstly by proposing the division of the empire and claiming for himself the satrapy of Egypt, before defying Perdiccas by stealing Alexander's corpse, which he used to assert his claims as the great king's successor. It was probably at this time that he invented the spurious claim to be Alexander's half-brother in order to galvanize his claim to the throne. He proved to be a successful military leader who orchestrated the demise of Perdiccas and managed to hold his own against figures like Antigonus, Demetrius, and Seleucus for several. He established control of the key islands of Cyprus and Rhodes, but was unable to fulfill his ambitions of becoming king of his native Macedon. However, beyond the failure of any one individual such as Ptolemy to win the wars of the Diadochi, Ptolemy's work laid the foundations of a dynastic state in Egypt that lasted almost 3 centuries. Most importantly, it was under his leadership that Alexandria began to emerge as the greatest city in the world for a time, a utopian center of the ancient Mediterranean, and a city which, even after the rise of Rome, remained the intellectual center of the Eastern Mediterranean. What do you think of Ptolemy I Soter? Should he be regarded as an effective military and political leader who left behind a stable and prosperous kingdom in Egypt to his successors, or was this only a partial success in the context of his claims to be the legitimate successor to all of the empire of Alexander the Great? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Pharaoh Akhenaten was born at some unknown date and year, though almost certainly in the 1360s BC. He died in 1361 BC, but most likely many years prior to this, 1368 BC or 1367 BC being plausible candidates for the year of his birth. His father was the pharaoh or king of Egypt, Amenhotep III. Akhenaten was named after his father when he was born, and while he is known to history as Akhenaten, for much of his life he was called Amenhotep. Akhenaten, as we will see, was a name he took himself later in his life. Amenhotep III had been on the throne for around 2 decades by the time Akhenaten was born, having come to be pharaoh in the early 1380s BC. It is not known where Akhenaten was born. Some Egyptologists have speculated that he may have been born and raised in the ancient city of Memphis, near Heliopolis, a city which had a strong cult of worshipping the sun god Ra. Others contend that he was born around the city of Thebes, the more southerly capital of the Egyptian kingdom in the 14th century BC, approximate to modern-day Luxor. There, a major royal palace had been constructed at Malkata by his father, and it would probably make most sense for him to have been born there. Akhenaten's mother was Tia, the great wife of Amenhotep. Egyptian rulers practiced polygamy and had numerous wives, some often being close relatives or even sisters. Amongst these multiple consorts, there was typically a great wife, and a pharaoh's successor would normally be chosen from amongst the sons born to this chief consort. This placed Akhenaten in line to the throne. He had an older brother who was also born to Tia, Prince Thutmose. Beyond these, Akhenaten had a very large number of siblings and half-siblings, owing to the polygamous nature of the royal court. The boy that would become one day was born into a part of the world which already had a very long history by the 14th century BC. Egypt had emerged as far back as the 4th millennium BC as one of the first major centers of Neolithic and Chalcolithic settled civilizations, as people began farming in great numbers along the shores of the River Nile. In ancient times, and indeed prior to the building of the Aswan Dam in the 20th century, the Nile flooded every year. This annual inundation deposited rich alluvial soil onto the banks of the river several hundred meters inland, allowing people here to survive out of the agricultural products grown on these floodplains in an otherwise arid desert environment. Based on this, an advanced culture with a writing system, industry, and other economic elements emerged, and by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the pharaohs or kings of the Old Kingdom were in a position to deploy resources capable of building the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau, next to modern-day Cairo. Unsurprisingly, a complex religious system also developed, one which lionized deities like Osiris, the god of the river Nile, on which the people were so reliant for their subsistence, and Ra, the sun god, who was so central to the lives of people who otherwise lived in the midst of the Sahara Desert. This pharaonic society had peaked early in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, as the rulers of what is termed the Old Kingdom built the greatest of the pyramids. Thereafter, it went through peaks and valleys. For instance, the 22nd and 21st centuries BC were turbulent ones of unrest in Egypt. But thereafter, the Middle Kingdom was a new period of growth. The bout of chaos came in the 17th century BC, when a people called the Hyksos descended from the Levant into northern Egypt, conquered the Nile Delta and much of the north of the country from the Egyptian kings. For a period of a century and a half, Egypt was divided and harassed by the Hyksos. Yet they too were conquered over time, and in the 15th century BC, Akhenaten's great-great-grandfather, Thutmose III, had overseen Egypt's rise to a position of unprecedented national power and wealth. Ruling for over a half a century, he reunified Egypt fully, extended its power further down the Nile into what we now call Sudan, and also conquered much of the Levant into regions approximating today with Palestine, Israel, and even towards Jordan and into parts of Syria and Lebanon. Trade flourished across the eastern Mediterranean, and an ambitious building program was initiated. This period of immense Egyptian power, which Thutmose was the greatest ruler of, is called the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history. Akhenaten would benefit from succeeding to the throne, as Egypt was in such a propitious position of power, but his reign would also stand as a period of turmoil within it. As the shadowy details of his birth would indicate, there is almost nothing known about Akhenaten's early life. But such is the interest in the reign of one of the most unusual and significant of ancient Egypt's rulers that many theories have emerged over the years. One holds that he was raised to a significant extent away from the royal capital at Memphis in the north, near where Cairo stands today. Here it is posited that he was a high priest of the god Ptah, the god of workers and industry in the Egyptian religious system. We know that his older brother, Prince Thutmose, served as high priest of Ptah as well for several years before he headed south to begin training as his father's successor at Thebes. The suggestion is that Akhenaten succeeded him in that role afterwards, and it may have been this time in his youth as a high priest that imbued Akhenaten with strong religious sensibilities. Other theories concern his education, with several well-known scribes of the time being suggested as possible tutors of the prince. We can be certain that one of these, a man named Parennefer, did indeed tutor young Akhenaten in his childhood years, as this Parennefer was later honored with a major tomb, where an inscription notes his role in educating the pharaoh. Parennefer would also go on to become the senior-most minister in Akhenaten's government in later years, and seems to have been a major influence on Akhenaten's life and reign. Some greater clarity possible when it comes to Akhenaten's wives and children. Though there is still a lot that remains speculative even in this area, one thing is for sure. His great wife or chief wife was a woman by the name of Nefertiti. They were married at some stage in the 1350s, and so she and he were most likely wed when they were little more than teenagers. They may have been closely related, with some Egyptologists claiming that she was a first cousin of Akhenaten's or some other near relation within the Egyptian royal line. She was quite possibly a few years older than him. Nefertiti is one of the most famous royal women in the entirety of Egyptian history. This is based on multiple developments. The first being her position as chief wife to Akhenaten, who would become one of the most notorious of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs. Secondly, she is famous for a remarkable bust or statue of her head and neck that has survived over 3 millennia. This painted limestone bust around 1345 BC was royal sculptor of time by the name of Thutmose. Discovered in 1912 during archaeological work at the city of Amarna, it presents one of the most vivid portraits of any Bronze Age woman to have come down to us. Finally, Nefertiti is well known for most likely being the mother of Tutankhamun, a pharaoh whose gold death mask, discovered by Howard Carter back in 1922, has become a defining symbol of ancient Egypt. Beyond this, she is also a good example of a royal consort who appears to have held a position of extensive political power in New Kingdom Egypt. Akhenaten had several other wives. One was Kia, a name which is believed to have been a shortened version of Tatukipa. If so, she most likely was a princess of the Mitanni royal family, a people who ruled an area around Kurdistan today, where the borders of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq meet. Accordingly, her marriage to Akhenaten would have been political to cement diplomatic relations between Egypt and a near neighbor. Other scholars of Akhenaten's reign argue that Kia and Tatukipa were two different wives. Kia was nevertheless most likely of foreign blood, as she is described in some inscriptions as being Akhenaten's favorite wife, one who evidently could not rise to the position of great wife, as she, unlike Nefertiti, was not of Egyptian blood. Akhenaten also possibly married a daughter of the ruler of Babylon in Mesopotamia, though her name is unknown, while there is speculation that he was married to an unidentified sister of his. From amongst these marriages, Akhenaten had many children. His marriage to Nefertiti resulted in 7 or more children, most of them daughters. There were numerous other children from his other unions, though the exact details of these cannot be reconstructed from the available evidence, and there would doubtlessly have been some who died in infancy as well, for which no record of their existence has survived. Akhenaten's earlier years were lived in the knowledge that his older brother, Prince Thutmose, was their father's designated successor, and so he would succeed as pharaoh upon Amenhotep III's death. But Thutmose died sometime in the early to mid-1350s. With this, Akhenaten became the new heir, and so from the mid-1350s, by which time he was most likely only just entering his teenage years, he began to co-rule with his father, an arrangement which was usually established to train in the succeeding elements of government and the religious obligations of the pharaoh. There would also have been a growing awareness of the fact that Amenhotep perhaps did not have long left to live. Statues and other visible depictions of the pharaoh, dating to the 1350s, depict a ruler who looks to have been aged and sick, while DNA evidence from his mummy indicates he may have been suffering from obesity and arthritis, though he was still only in his 40s. Incidentally, contrary to some popular views that the Egyptians had very effective forms of dental care, Amenhotep was also suffering by the time Akhenaten became co-ruler from teeth that were plagued with cavities and which would have caused him serious pain. It was this obese, arthritic, and pain-ridden figure who managed to rule down to around 1351 BC, though perhaps as late as 49 BC. Upon his death, Akhenaten ascended as pharaoh in his own right, initially with the regal name Amenhotep IV, though he would soon change it to Akhenaten. The first years of Akhenaten's personal rule were distinct from what followed. The 4 or 5 years in question, down to 1346 BC, have been termed the Karnak years by some Egyptologists, to indicate that he was still continuing to rule in a regular fashion from the seat of government near the temple of Karnak in the capital of Thebes, on the course of the River Nile in central Egypt. He was most likely crowned here, though possibly at Memphis, the ancient capital of the Old Kingdom. There are also inscriptions and other documentary and material evidence from the early 1340s which point towards Akhenaten continuing to worship multiple ancient Egyptian gods such as Ra, Amun, Ptah, Hathor, and Nekhbet, while textual inscriptions also refer to the gods in plural. He also continued to develop the city of Thebes, a metropolis which was at the heart of a rich and energetic kingdom. The late Bronze Age was a period of immense vitality and wealth of a kind, which would not be seen again until the Greek culture of the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Thebes was at the very heart of this. a bustling city where industries like stone cutting, painting, glass making, pottery making, and other crafts, as professional schools for scribes, medics, and other skilled workers flourished. Furthermore, with a possible population of between 80 and 100,000 people, there is a chance Thebes was the largest city in the world at that time. Life here in the first few years of Akhenaten's reign would have appeared perfectly normal. Few could have predicted what a strange turn things were about to take. Another feature of these Karnak years was Akhenaten's completion of some of the building projects which his father had initiated during his long reign of some 4 decades. This focused on the mortuary site which Amenhotep had decom El Hedden across the Nile River from the city of Thebes. The majority of the mortuary temple here has been destroyed over the centuries, but the layout of it can be reconstructed. It would have consisted of rows of pylons, indoor sanctums, and outdoor sun courts, so that there was an interplay of light and dark along the walkways. This was a standard practice of ancient Egyptian religious buildings, and if rituals were held here at specific times of the day, the shafts of light penetrating through specific parts of the building would have made a deep impression on participants in rituals here, particularly where gold objects were used to refract the sun's rays in different ways. It all points to the way the sun was already central to the Egyptian religious system, and provides a backdrop to the religious changes Akhenaten was about to undertake. Elsewhere in the building, 2 gigantic statues were erected, known today as the Colossi of Memnon. These 60-foot-high stone monuments loomed over the western bank of the River Nile, and could not have failed to impress people voyaging up and down the river on boats. The building work on the temple and the carving of the Colossi was also completed around 1350 BC, most likely just after Akhenaten had become pharaoh in his own right, and he would have overseen the rituals which no doubt accompanied the solemnizing of the new temple structure. The first years of Akhenaten's reign were normative in other respects. He continued to add to the great temple within the city precinct on the right bank of the Nile in Thebes. Here there is even an inscription depicting the new pharaoh making offerings to the god Ra, though elsewhere there was a subtle profusion of shrines and other religious spaces dedicated to the sun god Aten in the early 1340s. Elsewhere in Thebes, Akhenaten oversaw a said festival in the 2nd or 3rd year of his reign. This was in itself a rather peculiar move. Festivals were the ancient equivalent of a royal jubilee. They were typically only held after 20 or 30 years of the same pharaoh being ruler of the kingdom, and then every 3 or 4 years thereafter. In calling one within a few years of his accession, Akhenaten was indicating his willingness to break with tradition. His motive in doing so may have been a desire to establish continuity between his own reign and that of his father, and it is noted that the date of it may have fallen around the 40th anniversary of Amenhotep III's accession. If this is so, perhaps Akhenaten felt some vulnerability about having been a younger son and only emerging as the heir and then pharaoh in the course of the 1350s. The said festival may have been organized in an effort at legitimacy of his reign and cement his status as the new pharaoh. While there were normative elements to Akhenaten's reign during its first years, it would soon take a dramatic turn that has created an infamous position for the pharaoh within the history of ancient Egypt. The shift came in 1346 BC, though for how long Akhenaten had been considering this new cause, or why he decided upon it at this time, remains a mystery, with no clear answer. This all centered on the deity Aten, also spelled Atun, Atonu, or Eden in various other him on the word itself derives from Old Kingdom Egyptian and refers effectively to a or sun disk. Therefore, in its early incarnation, the name Aten was used simply as a noun to refer to the spherical or disc-like appearance of the sun when viewed in the sky. Over time, the term Aten became one which was used to refer to a sun deity or god. Aten was just one such sun god. The most popular and important of these was Ra, one of the most important of all the Egyptian gods and goddesses. one who was said to travel through the sky in an ark every day, bringing light to the world. While in the evening he retired and night fell. Aten was just one of over a dozen deities which emerged around the worship of the sun, day and night, in Egypt over the centuries.